Alright everyone, the other day Marianne Williamson, who you'll remember as the somewhat interesting hippie that ran in the Dem primaries in the last election, she was making a series of errors, a series of statements that were completely false about paganism. And so I figured as an expert in the subject, and attended to that, by the way, a second tweet about the wise woman thing, can't wait to get into that. I've covered this extensively because I've edited literally dozens of works, anthropological works mostly, on pagan forms. First and foremost, we'll pick apart her different claims here. Her first problem is that basically she's delving into, link in the description by the way, archived of course to her initial tweet and the thread there, the noble savage mythology, but there is a modern noble savage mythology 2.0. Now for those that don't know what that refers to, you can look it up, but in brief, it's the idea, romanticist ideal by essentially the Europeans and European diaspora in the United States, looking at certain groups of people that they considered uncivilized, but they said, well, they're not civil, they're not as smart as us, we're superior to them, but they've got some noble qualities. They looked at it was basically, part of it was painting and poetry and shit like that. Man started to feel disconnected from nature because of industry, because of expanse, because of all of these things, and it became westward ho, and you get like sort of the rudiments of what later became Hollywood cowboy tropes and stuff, about this brave, staunch Indian man, the redneck. He doesn't need all of our technology and convention, and look how healthy he is. And by the way, here's a fascinating tidbit that most people don't know about, even most people that study like anthropology and shit like that and would understand this particular mythology with regards to pagan or primitive people. It goes hand in hand somewhat with medicine. Have you heard of the Thomsonian method or herbal simples? The idea, roughly the same period, was that European and American diaspora medicine was wrong. That we were essentially ingesting mineral poisons and compounds that were bad for you, and that it was better to look at the people of the undeveloped world and say, well, they're just as healthy as us. They don't use calomel. They don't drink quicksilver for constipation or whatever, and they took some crazy things at the time. They have simple cures, herbs and spices and stuff. Maybe it's largely dietary. Maybe we need to get back to nature and we need to go back to herbalism. That particular methodology held sway for a half a century until it was finally the rationalists sort of push it aside. Once you get some decent chemistry, basically early organic and inorganic chemistry and electricity and some of these things, surgery starts to become what we could consider at least roughly pre-modern in that sense. It gets swept aside. But the noble savage mythology is wrong. This would be essentially, Marianne Williamson is essentially saying that the world is dying. This is for Earth Day. So this is framed against the environmentalist / climate change bullshit debate. Saying the world is dying, basically if we just went back to pre-Christian times, everything would be fine. People lived in harmony with nature, and I'm thinking to myself, she sounds like a Wiccan. Now, pagan and neo-pagan, or pagan and Wiccan, are not the same thing. Wicca is a modern invention by Gardner. It was basically loosely based on some elements of like the Leland works, but it's been largely discredited. The idea that there was like a pagan witch cult all over Europe for centuries and centuries, sort of hidden from Christianity, no. What it actually is just folk medicine and folklore and things like that, which is perfectly accepted by Christian adherents too. It is technically a pagan element, in some cases it's technically sorcery, but it didn't represent a distinct group. Likewise, the idea that ancient pagans lived in harmony with nature, like running through the trees and stuff, and when they shot an animal they venerated it and prayed to it or something, to the Great Spirit, that's bullshit. That's all an invention of the Romanticist period first and foremost, aberrant problems with early anthropology actually, mistranslations and so forth, because of that inherent bias, and also the lack of general archaeological and similar understanding. For instance, and I'll take umbrage with some self-professed pagans on this too, not naming names, the idea that like the Norse pagans wandered around in the trees and just wanted to swim in the fjords and go fishing and stuff, but then the evil Christians came and cut all their trees down. The Vikings were not all Christian. In fact, most were initially pagan. When they were making their longboats and stripping all the Norwegian and Swedish forest to the ground, pagans were doing that too. They wanted to go get silver mainly. They wanted booty. They wanted slaves and silver and gold and all the iron and all these other good things. They wanted trophies. They wanted human skulls to decorate their palaces with. That's what they wanted. The pagans were just as bad as the Christians. Now, I would say, one element of this is even funnier, which is that when you're trying to talk about, oh, the Christians this, the Christians that, all their holidays are based on paganism. Christmas, Easter, and so forth. That's pretty well solidly established at this point. The rituals, the trappings, the dressings, a lot of that comes from paganism too. The idea of this noble savage mythology that pagans were peace-loving and nature-loving, no, they weren't. They went off and slaughtered animals, and then they drank their blood and ate their hearts and then got drunk and raped people and enslaved them and stuff. That's what they did. Look at the so-called Native Americans, really the Bering American diaspora. Those tribes, interpreted in the postmodern sense, all lived together in harmony under the Great Spirit, and they had their meetings, their powwows and stuff, and then the evil whites came and gave them smallpox and whiskey, and the rest was history. That's what you've been taught by idiots. But it's not true. These tribes warred amongst themselves. Half of them had already been wiped out by disease before European contact. They're now saying that there's a possibility they got tuberculosis from seals. Now, that could have happened because of the Viking diaspora, but they definitely didn't get tainted blankets or something like that, or deliberately cough on a bunch of Inuit. No, they didn't even have the rudiments of germ theory at the time. They had no clue. They thought contagion was caused by bad air, like swamp miasmas and shit like that. Technically, there's a lot of rats and bugs there, but it's correlation and causation, I suppose. Then you have, secondly to this, her comment about the wise women. As she said, I guess she's a feminist. That is also a mythology. In anthropology, basically 70s and 80s especially, there were a lot of meanderings into religious history and stuff as Salem starts becoming more of interest. You get In Search Of, and the rest is history as far as modern sort of discourse, and it leads to Ancient Aliens and histories, mysteries, and shit like that. The idea that the burning times and so forth were basically a persecution of intelligent women who understood herbal and medical lore is completely wrong too. By and large, it had nothing to do with that other than maybe use of abortifacients, which would be true. But the persecution, if you look at actual lists, documents listing the people that were killed, there are plenty of men that were on that list, and most of the women were urban cosmopolitan individuals. They weren't living on the edges of society. That did happen. Someone lived on the edge of the town, and the women go to her for the abortifacient or for headache cures or something. Their husband can't get it up, so here's a concoction that'll help him get horny, basically. That definitely happened, but that's not necessarily the norm. I remember they were trying to cast what happened at Salem as some sort of misogynistic attack on female empowerment or something for a while, and it's completely asinine. That makes absolutely no sense. The wise woman trope is also equally debased. It's not recognized by mainstream historians. It's recognized by a very small block of pseudo-intellectuals who have women's studies degrees and call themselves historians. Okay, you wrote a couple of self-published Amazon works. All right, I've written dozens of them and edited over 300 more. Who's more qualified to speak on the history of the witch trials or something? I don't think it's Marianne Williamson based on what she's saying. It really pisses me off, actually, because people treat paganism, and by the way, paganism is too broad a term in general anyway. Is it Norse paganism or Greek? Because they're different. Even within paganism, if you were, like, for instance, a Greek pagan in the general sense, if you followed the Greek pantheon, believed in Zeus and shit, that didn't necessarily mean that you adopted the ways and rituals of each god. It doesn't mean that you necessarily agreed with your next-door neighbor on which was the most important expression. You could have been part of the cult of Dionysos, and they could have been like a mainline worshiper of Athena. One person says, well, I tend to venerate Aphrodite for my own reasons. Another person's like, well, I follow the ways of Artemis or Pluto or something. Totally different. Sub-movements, those technically are more what we would call like modern denominations. There's a huge difference between like Catholics and Orthodox Christians, or Mormons and mainline Protestants, or Sunni and Shia Muslims, or very Orthodox Jews and then more like Reform liberal Jews. A huge difference between them. Look at Hinduism. If you really want the primitivist side of religion, instead of saying, well, I'm gonna have a Thor's hammer that was probably made in China and get some love beads and I'm gonna go dance naked around a bonfire, that's perfectly fine. It doesn't even need to be spiritual. If you like nature, I do too. I love being out in nature. It is a spiritual experience, but it's not authentically a pagan element. It's not based on anything historical. What you should do is become an Agori. You should adopt Agori Hinduism. Like that goofball there from CNN that was eating human brain that one time and everyone jumped down his throat, and it's like, oh, he's practicing. They don't see anything wrong with it. They're probably actively encouraging it. Go debase yourself. Wash in human excrement and smoke bone powder and eat human brains and animal carcasses and sexually assault other people like an animal and be like an agori. Because they see it as purging all fear of death, and they're extremely tribalistic, live on the fringes of society on basic handouts basically from people, and are extremely holy. Their religion shocks and disgusts even most mainline Hindus. But that's by design. They're crucifying any concept of caring about death in preparation for a better life, essentially. A more spiritual existence. I have much more respect for them, by the way. The cat decided to give me a badge of honor there, I suppose. They were pulling each other's hair out earlier. They were fighting. Do that. Don't be a pretend pagan. A neo-pretender, basically. Neo-paganism doesn't even exist, by the way. It's just LARPing. Be an actually, like, study the Eddas or something like that before you start launching off about this Wiccan bullshit. I don't have a problem, by the way, with, like, Wicca, but you've got to understand, that sort of love bead and meditation hippie reinterpretation of religions that were very warlike, in fact, openly encouraged you to crush your enemy's skulls with a warhammer and thought you'd be benefited in the afterlife if you did. Don't try to cast them off as peace-loving hippies. They would have killed the hippies. They would have decorated their longcoats with their fucking rib bones. What are you talking about, Marianne Williamson? The problem is her lemming-like leftist fans, they gobble that shit up. They love to reinterpret what is old according to modern standards. But they're completely historically wrong. There's no element of authentic religion in anything that she's saying here. That's about all. Peace out.